The most important controversy in the last 30 years is now taking place between the Premier of Ontario and the Premier of Alberta. To put it simply, the Premier of Alberta wants to continue to develop the resource base of the tar sands. The Premier of Ontario wants to stop that so that the Canadian dollar will go down in value. Because a high Canadian dollar, worth more for instance than the American dollar, inhibits the export of Ontario manufactured goods. What you have to understand in Canada is that 52% of all manufacturing in Canada is done in Quebec and Ontario. And this simply means that they value the capacity to keep the Canadian dollar low so that a Western Canadian who wants to buy something has to pay more on the world market than he would pay to an Ontario manufacturer, which forces in effect a tariff on Western consumers. So for Ontario, a devalued Canadian dollar is useful. It benefits their economy. For an Albertan, a high Canadian dollar means they can buy more Japanese cars at less Canadian dollars. So to put it simply, the people of Alberta are being held in thrall to the people of Ontario and their economic interest. Now this is the way it's been all along. And what we used to talk about 30 years ago was the Canadian tariff system, so that there was a 30% tariff, we'll say, on every import from overseas. And the result was that Western Canadians had to pay more for everything they consumed, and their goods, their oil and natural gas and production and even agricultural production was sold at a low dollar so that it bought less on the world market. And this situation resulted in the accumulation of wealth, and manufacturing wealth and resources were used to subsidize Ontario's industry. And that same process is in play today. The one problem that the Premier of Ontario has caused is that people are waking up to the reality that Alberta is a total, complete slave of Ontario's interests. And what's bothered the Premier of Ontario is that for once Alberta was getting very prosperous, and the population, of course, has been going to Alberta to get jobs. This doesn't look good for Ontario, so all of a sudden they use their political clout. And you see, the bottom line is political power. Ontario has, together with Quebec, two-thirds of all the seats in the House of Commons come from Ontario and Quebec alone. So they control the political system. More than half the seats come from Ontario alone. They have more seats in Ontario alone than all of Western Canada. The result being that they can always accumulate the wealth of the Western resources into the pockets of the Eastern Canadian manufacturers, and we've said this for 30 years. But all of a sudden, Albertans are realizing how this is done. And the worst thing you can do in a corrupt system is tell the truth and let the ordinary person find out how it really works. And that's what's happening. I have tried for, 40 years to emphasize that the Canadian political system is basically corrupt. It's robbing the resources of the West to subsidize the political interests and the economic interests of central Canada. And this is not beneficial to the long-term interests either of central Canada or of the West. So the best solution, the only real solution, is to free the West, build an economy that is resource-based indeed, but gets the world market price for its resources, pays the world market price for its imports, and has access to the Pacific Rim and China and Japan and Korea, where all the economic advances, and including the Philippines and Indonesia, where all the real development and growth is going to happen in the coming days and months and years of the 21st century. The Atlantic was the pond of the 19th century. The Pacific is the pond of the 21st century. And we have to look to the West and look to the development of our own future, our own economic and political system, so that referendum, initiative, and recall gives us true democracy, and the resources of the West give us true and permanent prosperity. So obviously, I'm glad that the truth is coming out in the war between the Premier of Ontario and the Premier of Alberta. Free the West.